When George Michael walked into the recording studio that morning in 2000, he thought he knew exactly what Whitney Houston's problem was. 3 hours later, she would teach him something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. This isn't just a story about two superstars recording a duet. It's about the prison of perfection, the courage to be vulnerable, and how sometimes the greatest singers are the ones brave enough to let their voices break. George Michael had always been obsessed with perfection. When he recorded Careless Whisper at age 17, he made the saxophonist re-record the iconic intro 15 times. 15 times for 8 seconds of music. By 2000, George had produced some of the most flawless pop records ever made. Faith, Freedom 90, Father Figure, every note calculated, every breath planned, every imperfection eliminated. His vocal takes often ran into the 70s and 80s. But beneath that perfection, George was struggling. The Sony lawsuit had nearly destroyed his career. The drugs were becoming more than recreational. The facade was cracking. When his manager suggested a duet with Whitney Houston, George was skeptical. Whitney represented everything he distrusted: the Clive Davis machine, the calculated crossover appeal, the too perfect vocal production. She was manufactured, he thought, a beautiful instrument playing someone else's songs. He had no idea how wrong he was. The session was scheduled for 10 a.m. at Capitol Studios in Los Angeles. George arrived early, as he always did. He liked to set up the room exactly the way he wanted it, adjust the microphones, check the headphone mix. Control was how he managed his anxiety. At 9:30, while the engineer was still setting up, George decided to listen to the reference tracks Whitney had sent over from her previous sessions. Her solo parts, recorded in New York the week before. He put on the headphones and pressed play. Whitney's voice filled his ears. Every note was perfect. Every run was technically flawless. The tone was beautiful. The pitch was immaculate. The control was absolute. It was, objectively, a perfect vocal performance. And George hated it. Not because it was bad. It was technically superior to anything he'd recorded in months. He hated it because it was too perfect. Too controlled, too safe. There was no risk, no danger, no humanity. It sounded like a vocal exercise, not a heartbreak song. When Whitney arrived at 10:15, fashionably late as stars often are, George was ready. He'd spent the last 45 minutes building up his courage. He was going to tell Whitney Houston, the greatest voice of their generation, that she was doing it wrong. "Whitney," he said after the pleasantries were exchanged, "can I be honest with you about something?" Whitney looked at him with those famous eyes. "Always," she said. "Your vocals are perfect," George continued, choosing his words carefully. "Too perfect. Every run is calculated. Every breath is planned. You sound like a machine. Where's the messiness? Where's the humanity?" The studio went quiet. The engineer pretended to adjust something on the mixing board. Whitney's assistant looked like she wanted to disappear. But Whitney didn't get angry. She just looked at George with an expression he couldn't quite read. "You want mess?" she asked quietly. "I want real," George said. "I want to hear Whitney the person, not Whitney the product. Can you sing it imperfect? Can you let your voice crack? Show weakness?" For a long moment, Whitney didn't respond. Then she walked over to the vocal booth, picked up the headphones, and said just one word. "Okay." George had challenged some of the greatest voices in the world. Aretha Franklin, Elton John, even Aretha had felt his perfectionist demands. But he'd never challenged anyone quite like this. And he certainly never expected what happened next. Whitney put on the headphones and nodded to the engineer. "Play it from the top," she said. Take one began. And it was exactly what George had heard before. Perfect. Flawless. Every note in exactly the right place. Every run executed with surgical precision. The Clive Davis version. The radio version. The version that had sold 200 million records. It was beautiful. It was perfect. It was empty. George was about to stop the take and try to explain what he meant when Whitney spoke through the talkback. Again. "That was great," the engineer started to say, but Whitney cut him off. "Again," she repeated, "from the top." Take two began, and from the very first note, George knew something had changed. Whitney's voice still had that unmistakable power, that crystalline clarity that had made her famous. But now there was something else, something raw, something real. Something in the second verse, where the lyric talked about broken promises, Whitney's voice cracked. Not a lot, just a slight break in the tone, like a motion-overwhelming technique. George's hand moved toward the pause button instinctively. In his world, voice cracks were mistakes to be fixed. But something stopped him. Because that crack wasn't a mistake. It was intentional, controlled. Whitney had chosen to let her voice break. In the bridge, she took a breath in the wrong place, interrupting the phrase in a way that suggested actual breathlessness, actual emotion. The run that followed wasn't the calculated series of notes from take one. It was messier, more spontaneous, more human. And then came the final chorus. George had written the song to build to a powerful belted high note, the kind of money note that Whitney could hit in her sleep. In take one, she'd nailed it perfectly, holding it for exactly the right amount of time with exactly the right amount of power. In take two, she started the note the same way, but halfway through she let it waver, let vulnerability creep in, let the audience hear not just the voice, but the person behind it. When the final note faded, George realized he'd been holding his breath. His hand was still hovering over the pause button, but he couldn't press it. He couldn't move. The engineer looked at him, waiting for direction. George finally found his voice. "Save that take." Whitney came out of the vocal booth and walked into the control room. She didn't say anything, just looked at George with a question in her eyes. George played back take two. They listened in silence. When it finished, he turned to her. "How did you do that?" he asked. "How did you choose to be imperfect?" Whitney was quiet for a moment. Then she said something that George would remember for the rest of his life. "Because perfection is armor. I wear it when I need to. But you asked for my heart. Hearts aren't perfect." George felt something break inside him. Not in a bad way, more like a wall crumbling, letting light in. He'd spent his entire career chasing perfection, believing that if he could just control every variable, eliminate every flaw, he could protect himself from critics, from rejection, from his own demons. But Whitney was telling him that perfection wasn't protection. It was a prison. "Take one is what Clive Davis wants," Whitney continued. "Take one is what the radio wants. Take one sells records. But take two is what the song needs. You asked which one I can do. George, I can do both. The question is, which one do you want?" George didn't hesitate. "Take two." Whitney smiled. "Good choice." They spent the rest of the day recording George's parts. And something amazing happened. With Whitney's vulnerable performance as his guide, George found himself taking risks he'd never taken before, letting his voice crack on certain words, taking breaths that felt emotional rather than technical, choosing real over perfect. For the first time in years, George Michael sang like a human being instead of a machine. When the session ended at 8 p.m., George and Whitney sat in the empty studio, sharing a bottle of wine and talking about things they'd never discussed with anyone. The pressure of fame, the weight of expectation, the prison of perfection. "You know what the worst part is?" George said. "I recorded Careless Whisper 15 times, 15 versions of the same song, trying to find the perfect take. And you want to know the truth? The version everyone loves, the one that sold 10 million copies? It was take three. I knew it was right on take three. But I spent 3 more weeks recording 12 more versions because I couldn't trust my own ears." Whitney nodded. "I recorded I Will Always Love You in one take. One. And Clive wanted me to do it again. And again. Not because it wasn't perfect. It was. But because he couldn't believe something that good could happen in one take. So I did it again. Made it worse. Did it a third time. Made it even worse. Finally, he admitted, take one was the one. But I'd known that all along." "How do you know?" George asked. "How do you know when it's right?" "You feel it," Whitney said simply. "In your gut, in your heart. The technical part of your brain might say, that breath was early, or that note was slightly sharp. But the real part of you, the part that actually lives and loves and hurts. That part knows when the emotion is true, and emotion is always more important than technique. She paused, swirling the wine in her glass. The hardest thing I ever had to learn was that my voice is a gift, but it's not who I am. For years, I thought if I wasn't perfect, I wasn't worthy. But perfection is exhausting, George. It's lonely. It's a cage made of gold. George looked at this woman he judged as manufactured, as controlled, as too perfect. And he realized he'd been completely wrong. Whitney Houston wasn't too perfect. She was perfectly in control of when to be perfect and when to be real. She had mastered something he was still learning, the difference between technical perfection and emotional truth. "I've been doing this all wrong," George said quietly. "No," Whitney said. "You've been doing it the only way you knew how. Now you know another way. That's not wrong. That's growth." If I Told You That was released in 2000 as a single from George's album. It didn't become a massive hit. Both artists were past their commercial peaks by then. But for people who understood vocal artistry, it was a revelation. George Michael and Whitney Houston, two of the most technically perfect singers of their generation, choosing vulnerability over perfection. Music critics noticed something different about George's performance. "Michael sings with an emotional nakedness rarely heard in his work," one review said. "It's as if he finally stopped trying to be perfect and started trying to be real." George kept that session close to his heart. In interviews, he rarely mentioned Whitney by name. Their friendship was private, sacred, but people close to him noticed a change. His subsequent recordings had more spontaneity, more risk, more humanity. He started trusting first takes more, stopped re-recording things 50 times. "Whitney taught me that perfection is a choice, not a goal," he told his producer during sessions for his next album. "And sometimes the right choice is to be imperfect." In 2012, when Whitney Houston died suddenly in a Beverly Hills hotel room, George Michael was devastated. He'd lost touch with her in recent years. Both of them had been fighting their own demons with drugs and depression, but he never forgot what she taught him that day in the studio. At her funeral, George was too grief-stricken to attend. Instead, he released a statement. "Whitney showed me that the greatest artists aren't the ones who never make mistakes. They're the ones who choose when to make mistakes. She had the most perfect voice I ever heard, but she had the wisdom to know that hearts aren't perfect, and music is about hearts, not voices." 4 years later, on Christmas Day, 2016, George Michael died in his home in England. Heart failure, the official report said. But people who knew him understood that he'd been dying slowly for years, crushed under the weight of expectations, perfection, control. In his final interview, recorded just 3 weeks before his death, George talked about Whitney one last time. "Whitney and I, we were both prisoners of perfection, but she knew how to take the armor off. I never fully learned that. I recorded Careless Whisper 15 times trying to find the perfect take. Whitney could do perfect or real in one take. She just chose which one the song needed. I spent my career chasing what she was born with, the ability to be vulnerable on command." He paused, and the interviewer said he looked infinitely sad. "I wish I'd learned that lesson earlier," George continued. "Maybe if I had, I wouldn't have spent so much of my life hiding. Whitney tried to teach me. That day in the studio, she showed me that you could be powerful and vulnerable, perfect and real. I understood it intellectually, but I never quite managed to live it." The interviewer asked what he would say to Whitney if he could speak to her one more time. George was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Thank you. Thank you for showing me that armor isn't strength. Thank you for being brave enough to let your voice crack. Thank you for teaching me that the most perfect thing you can do is to be imperfectly human." 3 weeks later, George Michael was gone. Today, If I Told You That exists as a footnote in both artists' catalogs. Not a big hit, not a cultural moment, just a beautiful duet between two extraordinary voices. But for those who listen closely, it's so much more. It's a document of transformation. You can hear the moment George Michael stopped trying to be perfect and started trying to be real. You can hear Whitney Houston choosing vulnerability over power. Both artists are gone now. Both died too young. Both were crushed by the expectations of perfection. But in that one recording session in 2000, they found freedom. Whitney taught George that perfection is a choice, not a prison, that vulnerability is strength, that the greatest gift you can give an audience isn't flawless technique, it's honest emotion. If you listen to If I Told You That, knowing this story, you can hear the exact moment Whitney lets her voice crack in the second verse. It's subtle. Most people never notice it, but it's there. A deliberate choice to be imperfect, to be human, to be real. That tiny crack in Whitney Houston's perfect voice taught George Michael more about artistry than 1,000 perfect takes ever could. Sometimes the most perfect thing you can do is to be imperfectly human. Sometimes armor isn't protection, it's a prison. Sometimes the bravest thing a perfect voice can do is break. Whitney Houston knew that. And for one beautiful afternoon in a Los Angeles recording studio, she taught George Michael the same lesson. He understood it. He just never quite learned to live it. George tried, Whitney tried. They both failed in the end, crushed by different demons. But for 3 minutes and 42 seconds on a duet nobody remembers, they succeeded. They found that perfect balance between power and vulnerability, between armor and heart. And if you listen closely, you can still hear it. That tiny crack in a perfect voice, that deliberate imperfection, that moment when the greatest voice of a generation chose to be human instead of flawless. That's not just a vocal performance. That's wisdom. That's courage. That's art.